Kaladin strolled along the shattered plains at night, passing tufts of shale bark and vines, life spren spinning about them as motes. Puddles still lingered in low spots from the previous day's high storm, fat with creme for the plants to feast upon. When he'd been a bridgeman, Sadeas's troops hadn't stopped him from walking this path. Instead, Sadeas had posted guards at the edges of the camps and at bridges so the slaves couldn't escape.
What is there for men out here? Nothing but salvation itself, discovered in the depths of those chasms.
Kaladin turned and strolled out along one of the chasms, passing soldiers on guard duty at bridges, torches shivering in the wind. They saluted him.
There.
The war camps to his left stained the air with light, enough to see where he was. At the plateau's edge, he came to the place where he had met with the king's wit on that night weeks ago. A night of decision, a night of change. Kaladin stepped up to the edge of the chasm, looking eastward.
Change and decision.
He checked over his shoulder. He'd passed the guard post, and now nobody was close enough to see him. So, belt laden with bags of spheres, Kaladin stepped off into the chasm. Kaladin hit the bottom of the chasm in a glowing storm of light. He took off at a jog, spear over his shoulder. It was difficult to stand still with stormlight in his veins. He dropped a few of the pouches of spheres to use later. The stormlight rising from his exposed skin was enough to illuminate the chasm, and it cast shadows on the walls as he ran. Those seemed to become figures, crafted by the bones and branches stretching from the heaps on the ground. Bodies and souls. His movement made the shadows twist, as if turning to regard him. He ran with a silent audience then. Syl flew down as a ribbon of light and took up position beside his head, matching his speed. He leaped over obstacles and splashed through puddles, letting his muscles warm to the exercise. Then he jumped up onto the wall. He hit awkwardly, tripping and rolling through some frill blooms. He came to rest face down, lying on the wall. He pushed himself to his feet as stormlight sealed a small cut on his arm. Jumping onto the wall felt too unnatural. When he hit, it took time to orient himself. He started running again, sucking in more stormlight, accustoming himself to the change of perspective. When he reached the next gap between plateaus, to his eyes it looked as if he'd reached a deep pit. The walls of the chasm were his floor and ceiling. He hopped off the wall, focused on the floor of the chasm, and blinked, willing that direction to become down to him again.
Stones!
He landed in another stumble, and this time tripped into a puddle. He rolled over onto his back, lying in the cold water. Creme that had settled to the bottom squished between his fingers as he clenched his fists. Syl landed on his chest, taking the form of a young woman. She put hands on her hips.
What?
That was pathetic.
Agreed.
Maybe you're taking it a little too quickly. Why not try to jump onto the wall without a running start?
The assassin could do it this way. I need to be able to fight like he does.
I see. And I suppose he started doing all of this the moment he was born, without any practice at all.
You sound like Tux used to.
Oh, was he brilliant, beautiful, and always right?
He was loud, intolerant, and profoundly acerbic.
Kaladin stood up.
But yes, he was basically always right. Seth called this lashing.
A good term.
Well, to get this down, I'm going to have to practice some fundamentals.
Just like learning a spear. That probably meant hopping onto and off the wall a couple 100 times.
Better than dying on that assassin's shard blade.
The trick to jumping between surfaces wasn't the landing, Kaladin discovered. It wasn't about reflexes or timing. It wasn't even about changing perspective. It was about fear. It was about that moment when, hanging in the air, his body lurched from being pulled down to being pulled sideways. His instincts weren't equipped to deal with this shift. A primal part of him panicked every time down stopped being down. He ran at the wall and jumped, throwing his feet to the side. He couldn't hesitate, couldn't be afraid, couldn't flinch. It was like teaching himself to dive face first onto a stone surface without raising his hands for protection. He shifted his perspective and used Stormlight to make the wall become downward. He positioned his feet. Even still, in that brief moment, his instincts rebelled. The body knew. It knew that he was going to fall back to the chasm floor. He would break bones, hit his head. He landed on the wall without stumbling. Kaladin stood up straight, surprised.
Nice!
It's unnatural.
No, I could never be involved in anything unnatural. It's just extra natural.
You mean supernatural?
No, I don't.
She zipped on ahead of him. It was unnatural, as walking wasn't natural for a child who was just learning. It became natural over time. Kaladin was learning to crawl, and, unfortunately, he'd soon be required to run. Like a child dropped in a white spine's lair.
Learn quickly or be lunch.
He ran along the wall, hopping over shale bark outcropping, then jumped to the side and shifted to the floor of the chasm. He landed with only a slight stumble.
Better.
He ran after Syl and kept at it. Kaladin jumped off the wall at a careful speed, twisting to the side and landing back on the ground without breaking step.
Well, I'm not going very quickly, but at least I'm not stumbling anymore.
With each jump, he shoved the visceral panic farther down, up, back onto the wall, down again and again, sucking in Stormlight.
Yes, this is natural. Yes, this is me.
He continued running along the chasm bottom, feeling a surge of excitement. Shadows waved him on as he dodged between piles of bone and moss. He leaped over a large pool of water, but misjudged its size. He came down, about to splash into the shallow water, but by reflex, he looked upward and lashed himself toward the sky. For a brief moment, Kaladin stopped falling down and fell up instead. His momentum continued forward, and he cleared the pool, then lashed himself downward again. He landed in a trot, sweating.
I could lash myself upward and fall into the sky forever. No, that's how an ordinary person thinks. A sky eel doesn't fear falling, does it? A fish doesn't fear drowning.
Until he began thinking in a new way, he wouldn't control this gift he had been given. And it was a gift. He would embrace this.
The sky is now mine.
Kaladin dashed forward. He leaped and lashed himself to the wall. No pausing, no hesitance, no fear. He hit at a dead run. But that was simple. Kaladin jumped off the wall and looked directly above him at the opposite wall. He lashed himself in that direction and flung his body into a flip. He landed, going down on one knee upon what had been the ceiling to him a moment before.
You did it! What changed?
I did.
Well, yes, but what about you?
Everything.
She frowned at him. He grinned back, then took off at a run along the side of the chasm. Kaladin charged through the chasm, and the wind joined him, blowing at his back. Syl soared before him as a ribbon of light. He reached a boulder on his way and jumped into the air, lashing himself upward. He soared a good 30 feet upward before lashing himself to the side and downward at the same time. The downward lashing slowed his momentum upward. The sideways lashing brought him to the wall. He dismissed the downward lashing and hit the wall with one hand, twisting and throwing himself to his feet. He kept running along the chasm wall. When he reached the end of the plateau, he leaped toward the next one and lashed himself at its wall instead.
Faster.
He held nearly all of the Stormlight he had left, fetched from the pouches he dropped earlier. He held so much that he glowed like a bonfire. It encouraged him as he jumped and lashed himself forward. Eastward. This made him fall through the chasm. The floor of the chasm whipped along beneath him, plants a blur to his sides. He had to remember that he was falling.
This is not flight. And every second I moved, my speed increases.
That didn't stop the feeling of liberty, of ultimate freedom. It just meant this could be dangerous. The winds picked up, and he lashed himself backward at the last moment, slowing his descent as he crashed against a chasm wall before him. That direction was down to him now, so he stood and ran along it. He was using the Stormlight at a furious rate, but he didn't need to scrimp. He was paid like a light-eyed officer of the 6th Dan. And his spheres held not tiny chips of gemstone, but bromes. A month's pay for him now was more than he had ever seen at a time, and the Stormlight it held was a vast fortune compared to what he'd once known. He jumped a group of frill blooms, their fronds pulling in beneath him. He lashed himself to the other chasm wall and crossed the chasm, landing on his hands. He threw himself back upward and somehow lashed himself only slightly in that direction. Now, much lighter, he was able to twist in the air and come down on his feet. He stood on the wall facing down the chasm, hands in fists and light pouring off him. Syl hesitated, flitting around him back and forth.
What?
More.
He lashed himself forward again, down the corridor. Fearless, he fell. This was his ocean to swim, his winds upon which to soar. He fell face first toward the next plateau. Just before he arrived, he lashed himself sideways and backward. His stomach lurched. He felt like someone had tied a rope around him and pushed him off a cliff, then yanked on the rope right as he reached the end of it. The Stormlight inside, however, made the discomfort negligible. He pulled sideways into another chasm. Lashing sent him eastward again down another corridor, and he wove around plateaus, keeping to the chasms. Like an eel swimming through the waves, swerving around boulders. Onward, faster, still falling. Teeth clenched at both the wonder and the forces twisting him, he tossed caution aside and lashed himself upward. Once, twice, 3 times. He let go of all else, and amid the streaming light, he shot from the chasms out into the open air above. He lashed himself back to the east so that he could fall in that direction again. But now, no plateau walls got in his way. He soared toward the horizon, distant, lost in the darkness. He gained speed, coat flapping, hair whipping behind him. Air buffeted his face, and he narrowed his eyes, but did not close them. Beneath, dark chasms passed one after another. Plateau, pit, plateau, pit.
This sensation, flying over the land. I felt this before. In my dreams.
What took Bridgman hours to cross, he passed in minutes. He felt as if something were boosting him from behind, the wind itself carrying him. Syl zipped along to his right. And to his left?
No. Those are other windspread.
He'd accumulated dozens of them, flying around him as ribbons of light. He could pick out Syl. He didn't know how. She didn't look different, but he could tell. Like you could pick a family member out of a crowd just by their walk. Syl and her cousins twisted around him in a spiral of light, free and loose, but with a hint of coordination. How long had it been since he felt this good, this triumphant, this alive?
Not since before Tien's death.
Even after saving Bridge 4, darkness had shadowed him. That evaporated. He saw a spire of rock ahead on the plateaus and nudged himself toward it with a careful lashing to the right. Other lashings to his rear slowed his fall enough that when he hit the tip of the spire of rock, he could clutch to it and spin around it, fingers on the smooth cremstone. 100 windspren broke around him like the crash of a wave, spraying outward from Kaladin in a fan of light. He grinned. Then he looked upward toward the sky. Upward, one lashing, then another, then a third. Kaladin shot up into the sky, nothing but open expanse, an infinite sea for his delight. The air grew cold. Still upward he went, reaching for the clouds. Finally, worried about running out of Stormlight before returning to the ground, he had only one infused sphere left, carried in his pocket for an emergency. Kaladin reluctantly lashed himself downward. He didn't fall downward immediately. His momentum upward merely slowed. He was still lashed to the sky. He hadn't dismissed the upward lashings. Curious, he lashed himself downward to slow further. Then dismissed all of his lashings except one up and one down. He eventually came to a stop, hanging in midair. The second moon had risen, bathing the plains in light far below. From here, they looked like a broken plate.
No. It's a pattern. I've seen this before as well. In a dream.
Wind blew against him, causing him to drift like a kite. The wind spren he'd attracted scampered away now that he wasn't riding upon the winds. He'd never realized one could attract wind spren as one attracted the spren of emotions.
All you have to do is fall into the sky.
Syl remained, spinning around him in a swirl until finally coming to rest on his shoulder. She sat, then looked down.
Not many men ever see this view.
From up here, the war camps, circles of fire to his right, seemed insignificant. It was cold enough to be uncomfortable. Rock claimed the air was thinner up high, though Kaladin couldn't tell any difference.
I've been trying to get you to do this for a while now.
It's like when I first picked up a spear. I was just a child. Were you with me back then? All that time ago?
No, and yes.
It can't be both.
It can. I knew I needed to find you, and the winds knew you. They led me to you.
So everything I've done, my skill with the spear, the way I fight, that's not me. It's you.
It's us.
It's cheating. Unearned.
Nonsense. You practice every day.
I have an advantage.
The advantage of talent. When the master musician first picks up an instrument and finds music in it that nobody else can, is that cheating? Is that art unearned just because she is naturally more skilled? Or is it genius?
Kaladin lashed himself westward, back toward the war camps. He didn't want to leave himself stranded in the middle of the shattered plains without Stormlight. The tempest within had calmed greatly since he started. He fell in that direction for a time, getting as close as he dared before slowing himself. Then, removed part of the upward lashing and began to drift downward.
I'll take it. Whatever it is that gives me that edge, I'll use it. I'll need it to beat him.